I know that I am not alone in that if you go and you search on social media, you will see all kinds of people, with their rival fans, their national writers, all of these types of people who are out there saying, Jim Harbaugh was 69 and 24 in his first 6 years and 40 and 3 in the next 3 years would change, insinuating that the only change that was made was Connor Stalions. We're going to debunk that in a big way right now on this episode of Locked On Wolverines.
You are Locked On Wolverines, your daily podcast on the Michigan Wolverines, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Tuesday. I got the day right this time. We're bonusing today because the first time I said Happy Wednesday, I honestly thought it was Wednesday until I saw it's primary election day, and I was like, I got to go vote. Hence, little sticker here. Locked On Wolverines podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. That's right, we're doing two today. We'll still have a Wednesday show. But I got fed up and wrote 1,800 words. Because I was sitting there, I thought I was done with work for the day. It was a nice, easy day. Tomorrow morning's an early morning. And I'm like, I am going to just kind of take it easy and watch some Marvel movies. It's cold, it's dreary outside. Why not? And then I take a minute and start perusing Twitter, only to see a lot of people, including national, writers from big outlets out there saying exactly what I said in the open. It's just not true. If you watched or listened to the earlier episode from today, Tuesday afternoon, whenever it was, then you might remember me saying near the end, I despise disingenuousness. I am all about objective truth. You can disagree, right? Like I said before, you can disagree about the Jim Harbaugh, that he's responsible for Connor Stalions' actions or not. I'm not going to fault you that. And heck, he was suspended for 3 games, so he ultimately was held responsible for it. And I know there's people that want more punishment because they see blood, because it's Michigan. However, the objective truth is not that Connor Stalions was the change that turned things around. And we have talked about it a little bit, but I wrote a bunch of words. We're going to talk about it. Let's start off with what is equally as important as what we're going to talk about in segment 2. But Michigan players would tell you this is the most important thing, and it's culture change. When did we start hearing about culture change? It wasn't after Michigan beat Washington. It wasn't after Michigan went to Happy Valley and beat Penn State. It wasn't after they beat Ohio State. When we started hearing about it was March and April, when they started having spring ball. I ran into a Michigan staffer. He's still on the staff at Michigan at a car wash in Ann Arbor, because I was still living in Ann Arbor, and it was right across the street, and it was, really close to the facilities. And I asked him, because I was like, we keep on hearing on these Zoom press conferences, that gives you an indication of what 2021 was like, at least in the early going, that the culture's changed. I said, I don't know that I'm buying it. And he said, no, it's 100% for real. Everything feels completely different within Schembechler Hall and out on the practice field and everything. A lot of that, I think, has to do with the second point, which we'll get to. But it really was player-led leadership. And you saw it at Big Ten Media Days that year, because you had you had Aiden Hutchinson, you had Josh Ross. I don't remember who the third one was. I guess it was Hassan Haskins. Part of me thinks it wasn't, but my memory's not great. But I think it actually was Hassan Haskins. All of those guys said, we are sick and tired of losing. This is not what Michigan is supposed to be. And they led by example. You started having player-led leadership. If you followed along with this show for any length of time, but if you go all the way back to 2019, you can hear me talking about the lack of accountability from player to player. Now, I'll add one thing here. So I talked to Channing Stribling after he graduated in 2016. This was on 24/7 Sports. This is on camera. You can find these old articles if you really search for them. He was talking about the difference between those early Jim Harbaugh teams and the late Brady Hoke teams. And he was saying the Brady Hoke teams were segregated by race. Everyone was out for themselves. It just wasn't a very cohesive locker room. It was divided. But when Jim Harbaugh came, everyone got to be on the same mission, pulling in the same direction. And we went from there. Well, guess what? The next 4 years of Jim Harbaugh, 4 years, 17, 18, 19, 20. Everything devolved back into that. I started hearing about the locker room divided, even some segregation by race. Only position groups were hanging out with their own position groups. It wasn't any kind of cross hanging out or anything like that. That all changed in 2021. Everyone said, all those leaders said, get yourself a partner. We're going to talk to everyone on the team's going to talk to everyone else on the team, right? We're going to go out and we're going to be a team. They started having player-led meetings. I don't know that was the case before. Maybe it was, but these were more serious and we started hearing about them. At that time, Mikey Sainristil, who wasn't even producing on the field at that time as a wide receiver, was one of the ones who was instrumental in those, as was Cade McNamara. Michigan also, for all of those who sat there and said, Michigan hasn't had a quarterback captain. Shea Patterson wasn't an elected captain. He's not, what kind of leadership do you guys have? That was something that got talked about quite a bit from rival fans, particularly in the Metro Detroit area. And the radio station that was leading that charge. Well, guess what? Michigan went out and got itself a quarterback, a homegrown quarterback, after Joe Milton left. And which obviously he also partially left, I would assume. I never got clarity. I've talked to Joe since then, but we haven't talked about this. Because Cade McNamara won the job, stole it away from him, ends up being a team captain, ends up being a leader. Michigan had its leader at quarterback, a guy that didn't turn the ball over a ton and didn't make mistakes. This is something I didn't put in the article, but I bet you if I go and look at the turnover ratio for Michigan in the first 6 years compared to the last 3 years, it's wildly different. 2019 alone and 2020, those were turnover-heavy years. And the last 3 years, Michigan has been very careful with the football. That's been a big change. But on top of it, one of the other things that we talk about on the show all the time were those individuals. There were plenty, and I'm not going to name names because that's just not fair, but I talk about that 2019 game against Ohio State. And now there were 8 straight dropped passes. And it was just kind of like, oh, well, what you going to do? There was no one getting into those receivers or tight ends' faces saying like, hey, you've got to come up with that football. Do you know what game this is? This is the biggest game of the season. This is an opportunity to change everything. Nope, just kind of like, all right. It's like Ben Roethlisberger and Hines Ward laughing afterwards, right? Like it just wasn't a big deal for them. Now there is player-led leadership. There is accountability from one to the other. The locker room cancers were expunged. And you can tell who a lot of those are because maybe they left earlier than you thought. Maybe they transferred unceremoniously when you thought that they were going to be a bigger part of this team. The culture changed in Ann Arbor. Inside the building, that's what they would tell you is the number one thing. There is another thing that I think is equally as important, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. Before we do, I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But with it just being Major League Baseball season, I need more sports in my life. I need different kinds of games. I need variety because it's the spice of life. The sports aren't sportsing like I want them to, but FanDuel lets me keep them going whenever I want. All I have to do is open up the app, dream up any bets that I have anytime that I'm in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone all summer long, every single day. So head over to FanDuel.com, start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. I think the last time we did 2 podcasts in a day was more so because I missed days. Not because we're adding days. We're just adding them. The podcast is my priority now, folks. So keep tuning in. Make sure you follow over on TikTok as well. I have a little bit of creative fun and edit whatever I feel like is the most viral part of every episode. that I can fit into a smaller portion, and I have a little bit more creative fun with it. It's my creative outlet since I haven't started writing worship music and all these other things that I've planned on doing because my ADHD is at war with my mind and my body as well. All right, number 2, what's the other important piece to all of this? It is the coaching staff has dramatically changed from 2020 to now. Here's the coaching staff in 2020. Offensive coordinator Josh Gaddis, quarterbacks coach Ben McDaniels, offensive line Ed Warner, tight ends Sharon Moore, running backs Jay Harbaugh, wide receivers also Josh Gaddis, defensive coordinator Don Brown, defensive line Sean Nua, linebackers Brian Jean-Marie, safeties technically Bob Shoop, but he didn't coach in any games. He was suspended for off the field shenanigans. Isn't a good word. It's worse than that, but you know. And then Mike Zordich, cornerbacks coach. In 2021, there were only two people who were in the same role they were the year before. Josh Gaddis as offensive coordinator and wide receivers coach, and Sean Nua as the defensive line coach. Jay Harbaugh moved from tight ends moved two tight ends from running backs. Sharon Moore got elevated from tight ends coach to offensive line. And those are the only ones who were still on staff that moved around. Otherwise, Michigan brought in Matt Weiss from Baltimore to be the quarterbacks coach, Mike Hart from Indiana. They brought in Mike McDonald to run the defense from Don Brown. That's a pretty giant step, right? They brought in George Hilo from Maryland and Ron Bellamy from West Bloomfield High School. And I almost finished early there. Steve Clinkscale, who came from... He came from Kentucky. Kentucky, that's where he came from. The next year was even different, more different, because you still had Matt Weiss as the quarterback's coach. He was now co-offensive coordinator with Sharon Moore, who still retained the offensive line. Grant Newsome was elevated to tight ends. Mike Hart stayed at running backs. Ron Bellamy switched back over to offense to be the wide receivers coach. Jesse Minter replaced Mike McDonald. Mike Elston came in and replaced Sean Nua on the defensive line. George Hilo remained. Jay Harbaugh had moved over to safety. Steve Clinkscale remained. And then the only change the next year, there were 2 changes. Kirk Campbell got hired to replace Matt Weiss after he was let go due to the best way I'll put it is non-gambling serious computer crimes. And Chris Partridge replaced George Hilo. Everyone else stayed the same. So you literally had a completely different staff. Going from 2020 to 2023, there were only 2 names that remained, and they were in different roles. Now, Chris Partridge was a prodigal son, so there's that, but there was also a concerted effort into bringing in Michigan men because they played under either Bo or Lloyd or Gary Moeller. And they understood what Michigan was supposed to be about, and Michigan had kind of gotten away from that. So, with that in mind, you have, when you look at the last year's staff, you had Grant Newsome played at Michigan under Jim, Mike Hart, who played under Lloyd, Ron Bellamy, who played under Lloyd, Mike Elston, I think they're all Lloyd guys, who also played under Lloyd. So, a good... a third or so of the staff had played under Lloyd Carr, had played at Michigan. Elston might have had some time with Moeller as well. I'm just iffy on his timeline. So that was a concerted effort. On top of that, 5 of the assistants from this last year are all now in the NFL. Your defensive coordinator from 2 years ago is a head coach in the NFL. So maybe that changed, right? Mike McDonald, who came in and changed the defense to this Wink Martindale system that Michigan is currently running, is an NFL head coach. Now he's got 2 former Michigan assistants under him, Chris Partridge and Jay Harbaugh. And then 3 of the assistants went with Jim Harbaugh to the Chargers in Jesse Minter's the defensive coordinator, and then Mike Elston, Steve Clinkscale. So what changed? Maybe that did a little bit. Now you've got a bunch of NFL guys that are working there. So one of the other big things that came along with that, it was the philosophy change. Michigan started to try to change the philosophy offensively, at least, in 2020. Kind of started to get away from that, the speed and space that kind of wasn't working, went to more of, I mean, they always said they were going to be a pro spread, but you started seeing more of those Jim Harbaugh elements, the fullback and all of this. And I remember Josh Gaddis had told me at one point, like, Jim had mandated, I think this was in 2019, that he uses Ben Mason at least once a game. And maybe it was in early 2020. And so he tried to check that off of his list early, but didn't really want to use the fullback. Well, guess what? That became the staple of the Michigan offense once again. It became all about offensive line play and running. Michigan was okay at running the ball. They were pretty good in 2018. That was the first year that you finally saw an offensive line that was commensurate with what Jim Harbaugh was capable of as a head coach, or what you expected to see. 2019, it wasn't as good, but it was okay. 2020, it was abysmal. Like, they couldn't block up front. They were awful. They were a lot of they couldn't run the ball at will. The only one that seemed like they was able to was Hassan Haskins, and he wasn't a household name. And yet, in 2021, all of a sudden, the sophomore Blake Corum, along with Hassan Haskins, are busting out long runs. Philosophically, you could see the difference in week 2 against Washington. This wasn't like way down the road. There's like, oh, wow, Michigan's philosophy changed. I wonder if it was signs. No, you could see very, very quickly Michigan's like, we're going to run the ball against you, Washington, and you're not going to be able to stop it. And people complained in that moment. And people said, you're not going to be able to beat Ohio State that way, until Michigan did exactly that at the end of the year. Run, maybe like a little pass here and there, and then run. It became the staple of the Michigan offense, was the offensive line. We're going to bully you into submission. That was not the case previous. And suddenly, physicality became the name of the game for Michigan. On top of that, you had the defensive shift from Don Brown's, we're going to bring a blitz every play, you just don't know where it's coming from. Otherwise, everything's pretty much strict man. And he ran some zone with a little bit of success in 2016 and essentially no success in 2020. To a much more complex system initially installed by Mike Macdonald and perpetuated by Jesse Minter. That was the big change, because suddenly Michigan's playing zone, it's playing man, it's playing match. It's doing a little bit of everything, and it's keeping you completely off balance. It was implemented by Mike Macdonald, and it was perfected by Jesse Minter. That was a huge change. The philosophy completely changed for Michigan. On top of that, we talked about sign stealing way back in 2019, 2020. I think it was, technically 2020 by the time we started talking about it. And Don Brown's signs were stolen. Again, sign stealing is legal. Michigan failed to adapt. And they let Don Brown have a couple extra years. By the time that you were watching games in 2020, like, it was evident sitting up in the press box, Wisconsin knew every single thing Michigan was running defensively. It was obvious if you knew. If you really want to have pain, go back and rewatch that game with the idea that Wisconsin knows exactly what Michigan's running at all times defensively. You're not going to have a good time. So Michigan suddenly had changed some things. Suddenly behind the scenes, there were things that were different, such as Ohio State would sit there and be able to watch whatever Michigan signs were throughout the year, only to find out the week of the game they were completely different. And suddenly they were back to square one. They just got smarter across the board. So that's a big difference. All right, we're going to get to the last part of what has changed. And it's the talent. The talent is drastically different, and we can prove it. So we're going to get to that here in just a moment. Before we do, passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122, wow, another extra million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every single time or your money back, because you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, so the talent in Ann Arbor increased dramatically. This is something that people kind of talk about on its face, but I have never seen anyone put numbers to it, and I did. Reading myself, in Jim Harbaugh's first 6 years, he had 39 players drafted, or an average of 6.5 a year. In the 3 years since, he's had 27 drafted, just 12 less in half the time, and an average of 9 players drafted in each of the past 3 years. So that's 2.5 more high-end players going. And that's, I mean, obviously they've had high-end players that went undrafted and such too, but it's also worth noting in Harbaugh's first 6 years, he had 18 players selected in rounds 1 through 3, which that's like the matrix that we have used since I like what Dan Mullen had to say going into the Peach Bowl in 2018. The rounds 1 through 3, that's your kind of money spot there. While 14 players were selected in those same rounds the past 3 years. So only 4 less in half the time in the higher end. So there was higher end talent in the past 3 rosters compared to Harbaugh's first 6. Some of the 4 stars really matriculated. You had your Aiden Hutchinsons, Blake Corum, Mozzie Smith, David Ajabo. Those guys were all 4 stars. There's more than that, of course. But on top of that, you had the 3 stars that actually developed. You had Hassan Haskins, was a low-level 3-star out of Eureka, Missouri, no one had heard of. Luke Schoonmaker, a low-level 3-star out of Massachusetts, no one had heard of. Mikey Sainristil, flipped over from Virginia Tech, a low-level 3-star that no one cared about. Zach Zinter was someone cared about, but he was a 3-star nonetheless from Massachusetts. Mike Barrett, converted quarterback. But on top of that, they actually got production from the 5 stars. So here's the 5 stars that Jim Harbaugh either inherited or recruited that played a role more so in the time frame between 2015 and 2020. Rashawn Gary, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Aubrey Solomon, Cam McGrone, Shea Patterson. Shea being the transfer. That's it. Rashawn lived up to the hype in terms of where he got selected in the NFL draft, but not necessarily as far as production on the field. Aubrey Solomon transferred away. Cam McGrone was really good in 2020, but kind of felt like, man, it would have been nice to see him any other year. Shea, I think, gets underrated, but, that is what it is. For those 5 stars that were more important 2021 and beyond, one of them was important before 2021, but Dax Hill, J.J. McCarthy, Donovan Edwards, Will Johnson. All 4 extremely pivotal to the run that Michigan's been on. And that's not including the development that Michigan's had from several other players. Mason Graham, flipped from Boise State, was a 3-star at the time, ended up finishing a 4-star. Kenneth Grant was a 3-star according to the 24/7 Sports Composite. Still, at the end. Rod Moore was a 3-star according to the 24/7 Sports Composite. Chris Jenkins was a 3-star. Mikey Sainristil was a 3-star. Ronnie Bell was a 2-star at the time of his commitment with no Division I offers. Jake Moody was a kicker, and he ended up being absolutely incredible. And then you have the transfers that ended up not necessarily being these big end names, but were all just kind of hit. Olu, Drake Nugent, the last 2 centers, AJ Barner, Josh Wallace, Ladarius Henderson, James Turner, and then even one that's still on the team in Josiah Stewart. All of them were hits. Your hit rate on players was different because when you go back and you look at 2016 and 2017's recruiting classes, all those guys that you were hyped up about at that time, they didn't work out. 2018 is when you started to see it work out. You go through that list, it feels a heck of a lot better. You're like, man, they took Vincent Gray. And then you're like, man, they took Vincent Gray. I think he might have been 2019, but still. You look at Jamon Green. You're like, okay, they got Jamon Green. Hey, Jamon Green, he worked out pretty good, right? Their hit rate was so much higher, especially with the lower level guys. From then to now, we're still waiting to see some of these 2023 guys, right? The Breon Ishmaels and the Jason Hewlett's, right? They haven't had an opportunity because those who got their opportunity earlier made the most of it and they've had to wait. Whereas those are the types of players you would have been waiting on before. I didn't even bring up experience, that he had more experienced teams in each of the last couple of years. People kept on harping on all these same people that cry Connor Stalions. They were the same ones saying, well, Michigan won with this team full of super seniors. And then the next year, no, they won again somehow. They got all these super seniors again. And it's the same thing. So I do this show because I don't want to be a partisan hack when it comes to this. But what I don't like even more is lazy, which I think some of the people out there are lazy. Disingenuous, I think more people are disingenuous. Ignorant, I think even more people are ignorant of what's changed at Michigan. Or just lying to you. I mean, that's part of disingenuous. I hate it. It's so stupid when people are all of those things, because I think there is some combination of the lazy and disingenuous there. Or the ignorant. Like I said before, I don't like calling out names, but when I see people that I otherwise respect, like Adam Gorney and Stuart Mandel, tweeting out this nonsense, we have to talk about it and dispel these notions, because it is absurd that that's become a thing. It's just reductionist. And the NCAA has been allowed to poison the well because they're the only ones that are able to control the narrative aside from shows like ours. And they put it out there into the ethos, and people fall all over themselves to be able to try to prove them right. Like there are some benevolent overlord. It is beyond absurd. So that's why we're doing this. Now you have some ammunition. You go to the article on Wolverines Wire. Like I said, it's like 1,800 words. I still didn't even include everything I could have in there, but at some point I got to stop writing. And at some point I've made my point. Last point, Connor Stalions was around the entire time. He might have not been officially hired until 2021. He was around the Michigan football program from 2015 to 2023. So that didn't even change. The only thing that changed was he was officially on payroll in 2022, actually. That's the only thing that's really changed. So, all right, that's going to do it for us with our second episode today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for listening. We will talk to you again on The Real Wednesday coming up tomorrow as we react. We'll tie in some of the player stuff from Sunday with some of the player stuff from tomorrow. So we will talk to you again soon. Peace.